Hi everybody and welcome back to Murder at Bedtime with me, your host Lyndon. As always, if you are a regular listener, I think you are all awesome. And if you are a first time listener, I hope I can persuade you to stay. This is a 10 to 20 minute true crime bedtime story. No frills, no waffle, just you and me and a mic. Just to say, this is a violent crime against a young woman. So if this may trigger you in any way, it's best probably to give this one a miss. This podcast is not made for children. And with that, plump up your pillows, pull up your duvet, and let's crack on with tonight's story. Probably the town of Buckingham's most famous crime, the 1864 murder of Annie Leeson. Now, Annie was a stunning-looking 17-year-old young woman. The boys of Buckingham knew it, and presumably so did Annie. She liked to flirt and tease the young lads of the town, which was mostly taken for the harmless fun it was intended, as Annie was also, by all accounts, a lovely girl with a warm smile and a kind word for anyone. But it can become very dangerous if someone becomes obsessed, doesn't read the signals correctly, and cannot take rejection. And unfortunately, this is what would happen to poor Annie. She had until recently lived on Nelson Street with her widowed mother and elder sister Elizabeth, but had moved out to work and lodge just a few doors down the road at a shop owned by a Mr. James Uff, in some reports a relative. Being so close by, she would often drop in to see her mother and sister. Across the passageway at Norton Place, where they lived, was the home of the Stevens family, Robert Stevens and his wife, and their 24-year-old son William, better known as Bill. Bill was a tailor and had just returned from 2 years working away in London, where locals said he returned a different person to the quiet, likeable one that went to London. It is thought that he had fallen in with the wrong crowd there. Anyway, now he was back, and he had formed a very unhealthy obsession with young Annie Leeson. She did not share the same feelings as Bill had towards her, and she told her friends this. But she was still polite and friendly towards him. Bill's friends tried to tell him that Annie was not interested in him in a romantic way, but this just made him more jealous that she was talking to his friends and colleagues. He even told her he would blow his brains out if she married someone else. He decided on Valentine's Day in February 1864 to take it to another level by buying Annie 2 expensive Valentine's cards from which he received no reaction from her. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a very long time since I sent a Valentine, and even longer since I received one. Anyway, enough of my sad life, but isn't the idea of a Valentine being anonymous, your secret admirer, so to speak? So maybe Annie didn't know they were from him, or did know who they were from and didn't know how to react. Remember, she had no feelings towards him of a romantic nature. To make it worse, someone sent Bill an offensive Valentine which sent him storming around to James Uff's shop in a rage, demanding to know who bought the card. Mr. Uff told him he had no idea where the card came from, but it wasn't from his shop. And when confronted, Annie vehemently denied it was sent by her. By this time, Bill seems to be spiralling into depression and anger over his unrequited love of Annie Leeson. He would go out drinking with his friend and work colleague John Billing and tell him how his mind was tortured and his life in ruins. Now John knew that Bill had taken to carrying a cutthroat razor and had told him he would cut Annie's throat if she did not return his affections, and it was only the law stopping him from doing so. His father, Robert, was also worried about his son's state of mind, that he had confiscated and hidden the razor, but Bill either found it or acquired another. Even Annie and her sister Elizabeth both knew he carried a razor, but Annie didn't seem to have a clue to the danger she was in, thinking it more likely that he would use it on himself than her. So what was the catalyst for Bill Stevens to finally snap? Well, it would seem that something happened on the evening of Sunday the 21st of February, when Annie arrived at her mother's house and very angrily exclaimed that Bill had acted improperly towards her. Spoiler alert, we never do find out what he did. But said she would never walk with him again. Now, I am slightly confused by this statement, because walking with someone in those days was normally another word for courting. Also, in her later statement to the police, Annie's sister Elizabeth described her sister's relationship with Bill Stevens as a bit on and off. So was there more to this relationship than we first thought? Anyway, I'm going off on another tangent again, so back to the story. This rejection presumably had a very, very bad effect on Bill. We don't know what was going on in his troubled mind, but now, on top of everything else, the love of his life was now no longer speaking to him. It was probably now he could feel her slipping out of his grasp, and he decided if he couldn't have her, nobody else would either. On Saturday the 27th of February 1864, Annie finished work at Mr. Uff's store around 6 p.m. and decided to fetch some water from the water pump at the junction with Hunter Street. She filled her bucket, then on the way back decided to pay a visit on her mother and sister at Norton Place. She left the bucket of water in the passageway and popped in to say hello. She stayed about 5 minutes, then left the house and made her way down Nelson Street back towards Mr. Uff's. Now, an 11 or 13-year-old lad, once again reports are differing, called Richard Woodhouse, was an unfortunate witness to the tragedy that played out next. He was standing opposite the water pump, watching some children playing with their spinning tops and occasionally glancing up Nelson Street, when he saw Annie come out of the passageway to her mother's house. He himself started to follow Annie because, as he said, she was pretty. Now, I'm pretty sure when I was 11, I had no interest in women whatsoever and would have just carried on what I was doing. Anyway, once again, I digress. When suddenly a man he knew as Bill Stevens suddenly flew out of the passageway and ran towards Annie. Speaking to her, she didn't turn but carried on walking. Annie was just outside Mrs. Spicer's shop near the corner of Tingewick Road when Stevens grabbed her from behind, got her in a headlock and pulled a razor with force twice across poor Annie's throat. Blood gushed through her fingers from the open wound, and with her head lolling, she staggered across the road into Mr. Uff's shop. In the shop, James Uff was serving customers. Even with the shock of seeing a girl he knew so well covered in blood with a terrible wound to her throat, he acted fast. He flew around the counter and caught her and laid her down on the shop's floor, cradling her head on his knee while using a towel to try and stem the flow of blood. He sent a policeman, Police Constable Seaton, who was a customer in the shop at the time when Annie staggered in, to go and fetch Dr. Death. No, seriously, his name was Death. He only changed the spelling and pronunciation later in life to Diath, apparently. But I don't know about you. If I'm feeling a bit under the weather and someone says, quickly, go fetch Dr. Death, I don't know if I'm immediately instilled with confidence. Anyway, sorry, off I go again. But Dr. Death, I'm going to have to call him that, jumps on his horse and gallops to the rescue. Now I say that, even though he sadly could not save Annie's life. But another drama was unfolding just a few yards away up Norton Place passageway. Running away from the heinous act he had just committed, Bill Stevens headed for home, where once in the passage he drew the razor across his own throat and collapsed to the ground, laying in an ever-increasing pool of blood. Hearing him fall, Annie's mother and Bill's mother came out simultaneously from their doorways to find Bill laying in the pool of blood. They had no idea what had happened down the road at that time, so they set about helping the severely injured young man, when suddenly appeared Dr. Death on his trusty steed. He dismounted and immediately told Mrs. Leeson of the terrible events and to get to Mr. Upshop straight away. He then set about trying to save Bill's life, which amazingly against the odds he did manage. His injuries were so severe that he had to stay and be treated for 5 weeks at home with a guard over him at all times, so he couldn't try to rip his stitches open and finish the job he had started. I mean, they had to take great care of him, so when he was nursed back to full fitness, they could hang him. After 5 weeks, he was deemed fit enough to be charged with Annie's murder, and he was put in a cell at Buckingham jail, where he stayed for a period of time until he was moved to Aylesbury prison to await trial. The trial did not start until the 18th of July 1864 at Aylesbury Courthouse due to Bill Stevens' injuries. Plus, he had been refusing food, only drinking water, which in some reports say seeped out through his wounded throat. He was very pale and looked thin and unwell, and was given a seat to sit on in the dock. A blue neckerchief covered his wounds. Bill pleaded not guilty to wilful murder, but he was on a hide into nothing. The evidence was overwhelming, especially the voluntary statement that he made to Police Superintendent William Giles, in which he said, quote, "Oh, Mr. Giles, that scaffold at Aylesbury, am I to be hanged there in a prison, to die there and be buried in the jail yard and be covered up with hot lime? I cannot. Let me die on the bed as I am. I wish Dr. Death had been out at the time, and then I should have been dead, and I should now be in heaven with my dear Annie. How could I do it? How could I do it? But I did." Police Constable Humphrey Ray testified that while he watched over Stevens in case he should try to harm himself, he heard the accused say, quote, "Quite how could I do it? I wish she was alive and I was dead." He also stated when asked why did he do it, that, quote, "Against Mrs. Spicer's I spoke as civil to her as a man could speak, but she would not speak to me, but swung about, and then I did it." Mr. Payne for the defence did a sterling job trying to get the jury to decide this was not premeditated murder, but a spur-of-the-moment decision by a tormented, rejected, lovesick young man. Unfortunately for Bill Stevens, the judge, Baron Martin, was having none of it, and in his summing up he told the jury they should not return a verdict of manslaughter, for no man had the right to destroy a woman simply for denying his advances. Hear, hear. I can imagine you all nodding in agreement with that statement. A big cheer for Baron Markham. I say we could do with more of his ilk in the courtroom today. In my opinion, of course. Anyway, the jury took 13 minutes to find Bill guilty of willful murder, and he was sentenced to hang. Bill Stevens didn't mind dying for his crime, but he was terrified of being hanged. The last public execution in Aylesbury was carried out in the archway of the main gate at Aylesbury Prison on the 5th of August 1864. A crowd of about 4,000 people had gathered to watch the spectacle that day, people finding a spot from 5 a.m. onwards, and 40 policemen, some mounted, were there to keep order, but the crowd behaved impeccably. Just before 8 a.m, William Stevens climbed the stairs of the scaffold. He fainted briefly at the top step, but was caught by the warder, and he composed himself to make the final few feet, and his appointment with the executioner, William Calcraft. Now, Calcraft enjoyed his job immensely and liked to be a bit of a showman. His victims rarely died quickly due to the short drop method that didn't break the neck instantly, and Calcraft had been known to leap onto the hanged man and hold on until the poor soul expired. If you wanted to make sure your children behaved at bedtime, you only had to tell them. If they didn't behave, Calcraft would come to see them in the night. He really was the bogeyman of the era. At 8 a.m, Bill Stevens was launched into eternity, and as he had feared, sadly took about 5 minutes to strangle to death slowly. He was left to hang for the allotted hour, then buried within the prison walls. Annie, I believe, was buried in the new cemetery on Brackley Road, with contributions kindly donated by the townsfolk. Now here's a thought, what do you think? I'm not a lover of capital punishment, but I am of being punished for the crime you commit. So I wonder, in this day and age, William Stevens would probably have got his manslaughter conviction, and with good behaviour could possibly have been released after 10 years. Would that have been punishment for taking a young girl's life so violently? Let me know. Please look out for my Exiled Yellowbelly YouTube channel, where soon I will be doing a walkthrough of all the places I have described in this story, as they are all still there in Buckingham. I would like to mention the places I did my research: Buckingham Jail and Museum website, buckinghamshirelive.com, and the two excellent books, Buckinghamshire Murder and Crime by Scott Houghton and Buckinghamshire Tales of Mystery and Murder by a personal favourite of mine, David Kidd Hewitt. As always, I would like to thank mostly you for taking the time to watch this. Anyway, when you see this, I will have just got back for taking my parents on holiday to Yorkshire. So hopefully you will see some of the research that I got done there. And so thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, if you could subscribe to the channel and ding the little bell for notifications of other upcoming episodes, that would be fantastic. And I will see you on the next one. Good night.